Story time, story time with Nanny.
Hello Iris, hello Lachlan, Nanny here. As you know, when Nanny came to your house, she'd lost her voice, hadn't she, and couldn't talk at all. But Nanny's got her voice back now, but she's still got a really nasty cough. Oops, there you go. And actually, she's got a drink with her today because she keeps coughing. So she still can't come round and see you, but because I miss you so very much, I thought I'd read a story for you today, okay? So you can sit down nicely and listen to the story. Mrs. Wolf and Little Wolf lived in a tumble-down house. There were holes in the roof and holes in the walls. One day, Little Wolf fell through a rotten floorboard. "I can't stand this a moment longer," said Mrs. Wolf. "I shall go to the builder's yard and buy a hammer and nails." She popped Little Wolf in his pram and set off for town. On her way, Mrs. Wolf met a friend and they started to talk. "This is really boring," said Little Wolf to himself. "I'm going to go and have some fun." He climbed out of his pram and was over the fence in the twinkling of an eye. He rolled down a bank and landed at the bottom with a crash. "Go and see what has landed in the cucumber frame, my dearest," said Mr. Porker to his wife. "Look in the cucumber frame, dear," said Mrs. Porker to her daughter Brenda. "Look in the frame," said Brenda to her brother Brian. Brian Porker had no one to order about, so he went into the garden. He came back holding Little Wolf by the tail. It's a cat," said Mr. Porker. "It's a ferret," said Mrs. Porker. "It's a rat," said Brenda. "It's a tiny dog," said Brian, "and I shall teach it to do tricks." They went out on the lawn. "Jump through the hoop," said Brian. "There's no dinner if you don't." He made Little Wolf sit up and beg and taught him to balance a football on his nose. He's a clever little wolf, wasn't he? "Do go and fetch the Sunday papers, my love," said Mr. Porker the next morning. "Go and fetch the papers, dear," said Mrs. Porker to Brenda. "Fetch the papers," said Brenda to Brian. "Fetch," said Brian to Little Wolf. Little Wolf ran all the way down to the paper shop. Then he ran all the way back, carrying the papers in his mouth. The Porkers snatched them and they lazed around till lunchtime. "This house is a shocking state," said Mr. Porker. "Clean it up, will you, my sweet?" "Clean up the house, dear," said Mrs. Porker to Brenda. "Clean the house," said Brenda to Brian. "Clean it," said Brian to Little Wolf. So Little Wolf dusted and hoovered and did the washing up, and the Porkers just went upstairs and had a nap. Poor Little Wolf, look, he's doing all the work there, all the washing up and all the hoovering. Poor Little Wolf, that's not kind, is it? Little Wolf began to grow. Soon his jumpsuit wouldn't stretch anymore, so he had to wear one of Brian's sailor suits. "The fence needs painting," said Mr. Porker. "Will you see to it, Honey Pie?" "Go and paint the fence, dear," said Mrs. Porker to Brenda. "Paint the fence," said Brenda to Brian. "Paint it," said Brian to Little Wolf. So Little Wolf took a brush and a pot of paint and painted the fence a beautiful shade of blue. The Porkers sat under the trees and just watched. And there's Little Wolf, look, painting the fence blue. Nanny's favourite colour. Go with Nanny's blue house, wouldn't it? Before long, Little Wolf grew out of Brian's sailor suit. He had to wear one of Brenda's frocks. Dear. "The garden looks like a jungle," said Mr. Porker. "Tidy it up, won't you, my little blossom?" "Tidy up the garden, dear," said Mrs. Porker to Brenda. "Tidy up the garden," said Brenda to Brian. "Tidy it up," said Brian to Little Wolf. So Little Wolf mowed the lawn and dug the flower beds and planted some new trees. The porkers strolled about and sniffed the roses. Didn't help him, did they? Little Wolf was growing sideways as well as up. Soon Brenda's frock was too short and too tight, and he had to wear one of Mrs. Porker's old ball gowns. The weather got hotter and hotter. "Phew! Please go outside and dig a swimming pool, my pet," said Mr. Porker. "Go and dig a swimming pool, dear," said Mrs. Porker to Brenda. "Dig a pool," said Brenda to Brian. "Dig," said Brian to Little Wolf. So Little Wolf took a spade and he dug a deep hole in the garden, and then he tiled it, and then he filled it with water. The porkers put on their swimming costumes and jumped in. Poor Little Wolf there, look, he's so tired. He's not having a nice swim, is he? Soon Little Wolf was too big for even Mrs. Porker's ball gown. He had to wear one of Mr. Porker's boiler suits. One day Brian made Little Wolf show the porkers a new trick. "The dog is getting very big," said Mrs. Porker. "We need a larger house. Could you go and build one, my poppet?" "Build a new house, dear," said Mrs. Porker to Brenda. "Build a house," said Brenda to Brian. "Start building," said Brian to Little Wolf. So Little Wolf went to the builder's yard and he bought some bricks and tiles and timber. He built the porkers a fine new house. He hammered so hard that the buttons popped off his boiler suit. Be careful up there on the roof, look. Then Little Wolf cooked bean stew for the porkers in their new kitchen. Mr. Porker dropped his spoon on the floor. There it is down there, look. "Pick up my spoon, will you, sweetheart?" said Mr. Porker. "Pick up your father's spoon, dear," said Mrs. Porker to Brenda. "Pick up Dad's spoon," said Brenda to Brian. "Pick it up," said Brian to Little Wolf. And at last Little Wolf lost his temper. He took a deep breath and he roared, "No, I won't." He was so angry that he burst right out of his boiler suit. "Help!" cried the porkers as Little Wolf chased them down the garden path. When he reached the gate, Little Wolf stopped. He threw back his head and he howled and he cried. "Mum!" howled Little Wolf. "I want my mum!" Miles away in her tumble-down house, Mrs. Wolf pricked up her ears. She ran all the way to the porker's front gate. "My baby!" she cried. "How you've grown!" The porkers had gone for good, so Little Wolf asked his mother to come in. "What a lovely place," said Mrs. Wolf, and she admired the house and the garden and the swimming pool. "It's all my own work," said Little Wolf. Then they sat down together in their new home and finished up the bacon stew. So there. That's a nice story, isn't it? Because the porkers weren't being very nice to Little Wolf, were they? And he made all the effort to build the house and paint the fence, make the swimming pool. And now Little Wolf, who's not so little now, he's big, and his mummy, they got to keep the house for themselves. And I'm sure that they must have lived happily ever after, and Little Wolf would have looked after his mummy, wouldn't he?